Oyez, oyez, oyez. All those who have business before this United States Supreme Court are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. The court is now in session. Justices Hernandez, Morgan, Benjamin, Rauch, and Hernandez presiding. Now calling case number 2012-2013, Samantha Somerville and Sidney Kirch versus Olympus State University. God save the United States and this honorable court.
Please be seated. Counsel for petitioners, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Counsel for respondents, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Have we agreed upon the amount of time for each participant?
Yes, Your Honor.
And the timekeeper knows those times?
Do Your Honor.
Okay, if you would do me just the favor of periodically turning the times around so we can see them too.
Absolutely.
Appreciate that. Mr. Ferguson, are you going to start for the petitioners?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please come up to the podium and proceed. Please proceed.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. My name is Andrew Ferguson, and I, along with my co-counsel Katie Tipton, represent the petitioners in the case at bar. At this time, we respectfully request to reserve 3 minutes for rebuttal.
Certainly.
Thank you, Your Honor. I will be representing Ms. Samantha Somerville on her 14th Amendment challenge in regards to OSU's admissions policy, while my co-counsel will be representing Ms. Sidney Kirch on her First Amendment challenge in regards to her expulsion from OSU. On the 14th Amendment, petitioners ask this court to rule that gender discrimination for the purpose of attaining a gender balance in a public university violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And to this end, I offer the following 2 reasons. First, the burden is on OSU to provide a justification for its discrimination. And second, OSU fails the justification laid out by this court in the exceedingly persuasive test. First, the burden is on OSU to provide a justification for its discrimination.
Is the level of scrutiny strict or intermediate?
Your Honor, we're asking this court to review it under intermediate scrutiny, even though strict scrutiny is possible, in keeping with this court's ruling of Mississippi v. Hogan, footnote 17, which stated that if it can be tried under intermediate scrutiny and the policy fails, then it is not necessary to try it under the strictest of scrutiny.
Why would you not ask for strict scrutiny?
Your Honor, because OSU does not even meet intermediate level scrutiny or pass the exceedingly persuasive justification. In the foundational case of Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, this court cited Shelley versus Kramer, which said that equal protection is a personal right, which it is the duty of this court to uphold.
Was Bakke a majority opinion?
No, Your Honor, but the ruling in Shelley versus Kramer was indeed a majority opinion. And looking specifically to the facts of the record, the president of the university instituted an affirmative action policy in favor of men over women. And looking later in the facts, it states that if Ms. Somerville were indeed a male, that she would have been admitted to Olympus State University. And thus there is discrimination in this case, and as this court recognized in Johnson versus Transportation Agency, the burden shifts to the government to provide a justification.
Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only reason she was not admitted. There could have been some other plus factor. Had she had it, she would have been admitted. If she had been captain of a sport team, which she was not, perhaps she would have been admitted. So do we just assume that the only reason she was not admitted was that she was a woman?
Justice Hernandez, the record is very clear that if she were indeed male, that she would have been admitted to OSU, and thus gender was the deciding factor in her case and played a role in determining whether she was admitted to OSU.
But that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure that that necessarily follows. It is true, but if I could say if she'd been the captain of the tennis team, she would have been admitted.
Even though there may be other factors, Your Honor, that could have come into play, the fact that gender was the deciding factor in this case requires that this court review OSU's admission policy.
Was it the deciding factor or was it a deciding factor?
It was the deciding factor, Your Honor, according to page 4 of the facts. and thus it is the duty of this court to review that policy to determine whether or not it passes intermediate level scrutiny or the exceedingly persuasive justification, which was laid in.
Should gender be allowed to be a factor at all?
Your Honor, it is possible if there is an important governmental objective, yes, that it could constitute a factor.
Is there such an interest? Would you concede?
No, Your Honor, there is no important governmental objective presented by OSU in this particular case.
Well, you said that they were attempting to achieve racial balance. What they say they're attempting to achieve, gender balance. What you say they're attempting to achieve is gender balance as opposed to gender diversity. That's their position, is that they're just trying to achieve diversity.
Respectfully, Justice Morgan, the very facts of the record indicate from the words of the president of the university themselves that the goal is a gender balance, or to reduce the gender gap at Olympus State University. And this is distinct from true gender diversity, which this court discussed in both Grutter versus Bollinger and Parents Involved in Community Schools versus Seattle School District No. 1.
Have we ever said that gender balance was a substantial government interest before?
No, Your Honor, gender balancing is not an important governmental objective. In fact, it goes contrary to this court's discussion of diversity, as highlighted in the case of Kieshian versus the Board of the Regents of the University of the State of New York, as cited in Grutter versus Bollinger.
Well, what was the interest at stake in the United States versus Virginia?
This interest in that particular case, Justice Hernandez, was the attempt to maintain a variety of pedagogical approaches in higher level education by maintaining single-sex institutions. But this court ruled that didn't even rise to the level of an important governmental objective. Or in the case of Mississippi versus Hogan, the interest was providing compensatory action for women in education. But again, this court ruled that did not rise to the level of an important governmental objective. The simple fact is that diversity...
Isn't it a little different, though, when you had, in the VMI case, for example, you had a wholesale exclusion of women. I mean, here the university is not completely excluding women.
That is
it's
true,
just trying to add more men into the mix, given the great disparity between men and women admitted.
Yes, Your Honor, but the fact that gender was the determining factor in Ms. Somerville's admission requires that this court determine whether or not that was justified. And the simple fact is that OSU is not seeking true diversity, which this court defined as exposing students to a broad array of ideas to prepare them for life after graduation in their professional careers. And that centers on the idea, as discussed in Grutter versus Bollinger, of a critical mass, which this court defined as a meaningful representation, or where a particular group does not feel isolated, or that the individuals feel that they are the only ones representing their particular group. And the simple fact is that OSU has 36%, over 5,000 males on its campus. And those males cannot feel that they are isolated in the academic environment, or that they are the only ones representing their particular
Even when they're outnumbered, it's almost a 2-to-1 ratio. What is a critical, where's the line for a critical mass?
Your Honor, the only numbers that we have in our record discussing a critical mass are first in United States versus Virginia, which states that in gender cases, a critical mass could constitute as low as 10% of the university. Or in the case of Grutter versus Bollinger dealing with race, the number was somewhere around 14.5%. But this court has refused to put an exact number on what a critical mass is, because that would indeed constitute a quota, which would be contrary to this court's ruling in Gratz versus Bollinger, but rather that it requires that there be a meaningful representation of students of a particular group. And OSU already has that critical mass of males on campus, and thus any attempt to go beyond that and admit more males beyond a critical mass proceeds to the level of balancing, which is indeed patently unconstitutional, and therefore OSU does not seek an important governmental objective and fails the first prong of the exceedingly persuasive justification. And the second prong requires that the policy be substantially related to the achievement of an important governmental objective. And this would require that OSU use individualized review in keeping with this court's ruling in Grutter versus Bollinger. But in that case, this court recognized that the Michigan Law School was indeed using individualized review because whites, the equivalent of women in this case, were admitted with low test scores but other soft diversity variables. There's no indication in this record that women were admitted with lower test scores and other diversity variables, emphasizing the fact that OSU was not seeking diversity as a whole in its institution, but using gender as a shorthand for determining who it admitted. And because OSU fails both prongs of the exceedingly persuasive justification, it fails the burden that this court has placed upon it to justify discrimination, and OSU's policy is indeed unconstitutional. And for these reasons, we respectfully ask this court to reverse the decision of the 14th Circuit.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson.
Your Honors.
Ms. Tipton? Please proceed.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. My name is Katie Tipton, and I represent the petitioner, Ms. Sydney Kirsch, on her First Amendment challenge. I ask this court to reverse the decision of the Court of Appeals and rule that the university's efforts to silence Ms. Kirsch violated her right to free association and cannot be justified.
Effort to silence her? Don't you think that's overstating things a bit?
Not at all, Your Honor. The university completely denied Ms. Kirsch her right to meet on campus, and it is not justified under the compelling interest test.
Well, she wasn't really silenced. She was just required to include males in the group.
Your Honor, this moves directly to my first argument, that WTE should be allowed to meet on campus as a non-sanctioned group. And this course precedent in Christian Legal Society versus Martinez clarifies this. Because in Christian Legal Society, the Christian Legal Society was denied recognized status at Hastings Law School. But this denial just meant that CLS didn't receive money from Hastings and couldn't use Hastings' logo. CLS was still allowed to meet on campus, excluding whomever they wanted to exclude, and could use university facilities. But in the case at bar for WTE, being denied sanctioned status at OSU meant that WTE had no right to speak on campus and no right to associate. But in CLS, the court held that the First Amendment shields CLS against state prohibition of its expressive activity.
Well, in this case, you were seeking to exclude men from the group, correct?
Yes, Justice Benjamin.
For what reason other than them being men were
Your
they
Honor,
excluded?
Your Honor, men were excluded from Women for True Equality because the association believes that it will undermine their fundamental message.
Is the test that we use the subjective decision of the group or the objective application of existing law?
It is certainly not subjective, Your Honor, and it is the objective test of the compelling interest test, since Olympus State University's facilities at large are a designated public forum. And this moves me to my second argument, that OSU's honor code impermissibly burdens the message of Women for True Equality and
Well,
can't
let's
be
go back
justified.
to the gender thing. But for them being men, you would have let them in.
Yes, Justice Benjamin.
So it wasn't because of their view, it was because of their gender. Why is that not impermissible? And why would the university be wrong in applying its policy in a neutral manner?
Justice Benjamin, this court recognized in Roberts versus United States Jaycees that the freedom to associate does include the right not to associate. And the court recognized in New York State Club Association versus New York City that an association might be able to demonstrate that its expressive purposes would be thwarted if it couldn't limit its members.
Well, how does having men in the group thwart their purpose? Isn't the purpose that they're opposed to the policy of the university? And what if the men have this exact same view?
Your Honor, the purpose is in part to oppose the policy of the university, but Women for True Equality also clearly states that men cannot be trusted, and this is a key part of their message. In order to ensure that their viewpoint is also promoted through a female perspective, WTE's limited their membership to men. To include men in a group that advocates that men can't be trusted would ultimately turn their message into a paradox.
So if there's a white group that says black people can't be trusted, that group has to be given sanction to speak and appear on the university campus.
Justice Hernandez, it doesn't necessarily need to be given sanction, but it does have the right to meet on campus if that exclusion is necessary to its expressive purposes.
And it has the right to school funds. It has the right to complete support from the university.
No, Your Honor, but it does have the right to meet on campus. Women for True Equality
Using the
isn't-
electricity and the rooms and the heat that are paid for by state tax dollars by a state institution.
And being recognized by the university as well.
Your Honors, while it would include using the university facilities, WTE does not need to be sanctioned. I argue right now that petitioner has the right to associate as a non-sanctioned group, just like CLS did in CLS versus Martinez.
Can I ask you one more question about the message? Didn't the group suggest that if the admissions issues were handled properly, the group might disband at that point?
Yes,
So
Justice.
doesn't that suggest that the purpose of the group is really to oppose the admission standards, which men could do just as much as women could?
Justice Brock, the record does indicate that they might disband. However, this court held in Boy Scouts of America versus Dale that a particular part of a group's expression doesn't need to be the purpose of the group in order to receive First Amendment protection. And when a group is acting consistently with its expressed message, this court has deferred to the association's assertion of what would
But
burden.
that case was different, though, because you had someone who wanted to come into leadership in the organization who actually was opposing one of the central tenets of the organization. The same thing was true in the Hurley case. You know, you had people who wanted to speak in ways that were counter to the purpose of the parade. So isn't that fundamentally different here? And in fact, couldn't the presence of men in the group further the group? You know, if you have men who say, we agree, doesn't that strengthen the group's message?
Justice Hernandez, the record only indicates that the men agreed with the part of WTE's message about the admissions program, as page 6, paragraph 6 of the record indicates. It never specifies that the men agreed with the rest of WTE's message. Additionally, this court has recognized in Hurley versus Irish American Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Group of Boston that every participating unit affects the message conveyed by the group. And that is the case with WTE. Every person present adds to the message of the group.
So we have to assume that these men who want to join the group somehow may be lying, or they may be corrosive to the group, even though there's no evidence in the record to support that.
No, Your Honor, we don't need to assume that they're lying. But it is the duty of the court to defer to the association as precedent requires.
How far does that deference go?
Your Honor, it only goes so far as a group is acting consistently with its message. And this was seen in Roberts versus United States Jaycees.
But doesn't that at some point then just simply become an excuse for pervasive discrimination throughout our society and the utilization of state resources to further that pervasive discrimination?
No, Your Honor, it does not, because precedent in the Jaycees case guards against this. Where since the Jaycees were acting inconsistently with their message that excluding women was necessary, the court ruled that the Jaycees should have to include women as partial members and as voting members. The proper test that this court must use to evaluate OSU's honor code and the infringement that it puts on WTE's message is strict scrutiny. The only compelling interest the university can implicate is combating invidious discrimination in the place of public accommodation or in access to publicly available goods and service that was recognized in New York State Club Association versus New York City. But this does not mean that the state has an interest in regulating the membership of private associations. Nothing about Women for True Equality is a publicly available good or service to which the state must regulate. Additionally, this is then not the least restrictive means on associational activity, because the state would be trying to further access to a public accommodation through a private group, and this can simply not withstand a constitutional muster. Finally, denial of sanction status to Women for True Equality violated Ms. Kirsch's rights because OSU's sanctioned student organization policy is not reasonable nor viewpoint neutral. Jumping to the viewpoint neutrality, a viewpoint neutral policy will ultimately not neutralize the ability of a group to express its desired viewpoints. And OSU has taken
Isn't that what we held in Martinez?
Yes, Justice Hernandez, the court did hold that that policy was viewpoint neutral. But we asked this court to have a deeper understanding of viewpoint neutrality, because in this case, the government has taken its burden of being viewpoint neutral in its limited public forum and placed it on the individual groups, forcing the individual groups to be viewpoint neutral. And this court recognized in California Democratic Party versus Jones that the membership of a group ultimately composes its message. For these reasons, I ask this court to reverse the decision of the Court of Appeals and find that Ms. Kirsch's rights were violated both by her expulsion and the denial of sanction status.
Thank you, Ms. Tipton. Counsel for respondent. Please proceed.
Honorable Chief Justice, Associate Justices, may it please the Court. Good evening. My name is Alexi Ehrlich, and I, along with my co-counsel, Ms. Amanda Collins, rise on behalf of Respondent, Olympus State University. My co-counsel will later address the First Amendment issue, but now I ask that this Court turn its attention to the 14th Amendment question of equal protection analysis. Your Honors, the issue before this Court today is not one of invidious gender discrimination, as opposing counsel has insinuated, but rather a question of whether this Court will continue to grant institutions of higher education the deference which they need to further their role of educating our nation's future leaders.
Well, we didn't grant that deference in the VMI case, did we?
Your Honor, while this court has certainly declared programs unconstitutional in the past, which have been utilized by institutions of higher education, it is important within the analysis of this entire case to keep in mind what this court has stated in Regents of the University of California versus Bakke and in Grutter versus Bollinger, that academic freedom is of critical importance. Your Honors,
But it's not a blank check.
no, Your Honors, it is not a blank check, to use your words, because Olympus State University's program must still pass the proper standard of scrutiny review, which in this case is intermediate scrutiny analysis. It was first held...
Well, now, I would like to go back to this issue of diversity versus balance. The petitioner claims that you're trying to balance the genders at OSU, and you claim that you're trying to achieve diversity. How can we tell the difference?
Your Honor, the distinction to be made here is that balancing utilized by Olympus State University is merely seeking to achieve its diversity. Ultimately, the goal of Olympus State, as cited on page 4 of the record, is to increase diversity overall on its campus. It was opposing counsel has cited the cases of Grutter versus Bollinger and parents involved in community schools versus Seattle school districts to say that balancing is unconstitutional. However, this is a mischaracterization of both of these cases because both cases explicitly stated that it is balancing for balancing's sake that is a patently unconstitutional.
Well, how do you address counsel's point about critical mass in references to maybe even 10% constituting a critical mass, whereas here we have more than 3 times that? Don't we have a critical mass here?
Your Honor, Olympus State University is not justifying its program based on the fact that it is seeking to necessarily achieve a critical mass of male students at the university, but rather that it is seeking to achieve, to use the words of this court, Your Honor, the laudable educational benefits which are associated with diversity.
But are you then suggesting that we repudiate what we've said about critical mass before?
No, Your Honor. However, the instances of this, there are certainly some slight dissimilarities between the case at bar and Grutter. This is a case dealing with gender. And while there are still many similarities, the idea of a critical mass is not as applicable to the case at bar.
Tell me how the academic life or educational purposes of the university will look different if there's a 50-50 balance versus a 64-36 balance. How would that be different?
Your Honors, it is the view of Olympus State's administrators, as stated on page 4 of the record, that they believe that having a more equitable gender ratio will help to increase cross-gender understanding and help to foster a better classroom environment, as well as help in the social environment of the school.
So because of that, you want more men in the school?
Yes, Your Honor.
But the issue here doesn't seem to be wanting more men in the school, but excluding this woman. Those are two very different things. Couldn't the goal here be achieved just as equally by bringing this woman in, but also bringing more men in?
Your Honor, the issue here is that Olympus State has a limited amount of spots available in its each incoming class. Within these spots, it needs to decide who can best add to the learning environment at its institution.
So you're saying that it's not a reasonable accommodation for them to open more slots? That there's not more room for maybe 5 more people or 10 more people in the school?
Your Honor, while it may be available to Olympus State University to add more spots to its incoming classes, that does not mean that the means utilized, that its program is unconstitutional. Olympus State University's program is constitutional because it passes both prongs of intermediate scrutiny analysis. Your Honors, the first prong of intermediate scrutiny requires that Olympus State's program provide an important government interest. In this case, Your Honors, Olympus State's program is seeking the governmental objective of diversity, which is held to be a compelling government interest in the cases of Bakke, Gratz versus Bollinger, and Grutter versus Bollinger. This court has stated that the atmosphere of speculation, experiment...
How many more men do you need to be diverse?
Your Honor, as stated on page 4 of the record, Olympus State University's goal is to have as much balance between the genders as possible. And Your Honor, it is important to note that is...
Well, as much balance as possible is 50-50. I mean, that's a perfect balance. So you're saying that's the standard? Anything less than that is not acceptable?
Respectfully, no, Your Honor. As possible means within the context of Olympus State's larger diversity promoting scheme. This program utilized by Olympus State University is not solely seeking to only add more men to the student body.
So then the compelling governmental interest is gender balance. In what case do you cite for the proposition that that's an appropriate, not compelling, but important, I'm sorry, government? Well, you would, if we say strict scrutiny, you would say that's the compelling interest as well. But the governmental interest at play here is gender balance.
Respectfully, no, Your Honor. The governmental interest at stake here is that of diversity. I was merely stating that Olympus State University takes into account a wide variety of soft variables which would help to add to the overall diverse environment, aside from gender, as stated on page 4, paragraph 3 of the record.
So 36 isn't diverse. How about 46? Is 46 diverse?
Your Honor, Olympus State, there's no numbers indicated within the record as to what exact balance Olympus State University is seeking.
You don't know what you're looking for, you just know you don't have it?
Yes, Your Honor. Olympus State University defines its program, to use the words of this court, based on the laudable educational benefits that are derived from diversity. But it is important for this court to note that Olympus State University is not solely taking gender into account. This is within the context of a larger diversity promoting program.
Well, if she had been a man, would she have been admitted?
Yes, Your Honor.
So, but for her gender, she would have been a student.
Yes, Your Honor.
That certainly sounds like gender discrimination.
Your Honor, while it is unfortunate that Ms. Somerville was denied acceptance to Olympus State University, the fact that if she had been a male, she would have been accepted, does not make Olympus State University's program unconstitutional. On page 229 of Grutter versus Bollinger, this court stated that the University of Michigan Law School's program was still constitutional, even though it allowed race to be a decisive factor in many instances. Your Honors, also in Grutter versus Bollinger, the court stated that race was allowed to be, and I quote, Your Honors, extremely strong factor in the admissions process. And this was under the standard of strict scrutiny.
But here it's the dispositive factor.
Your Honor, in this instance, gender has been used as a plus factor within the admissions process in an individualized manner. As it was stated in Grutter versus Bollinger, for a program to pass the second prong of scrutiny, in that instance strict scrutiny, and in this case intermediate scrutiny, such a diversity promoting program must be individualized, holistic, and not establish any rigid quota system.
Well, Counsel, I guess I'd like to hear something about the means that you're using to get toward this goal as well. And I'm curious, aren't there less restrictive means? And I know that may not be the precise test under intermediate scrutiny, but aren't there other things the school could be doing, such as adding some more intramural programs that perhaps would draw male students? Some academic majors that statistics show draw more male students. Why do you need to go to this point as opposed to trying those things?
Your Honor, Olympus State University has tried a variety of programs in order to achieve a more equitable gender ratio, such as offering free admissions clinics for men or giving out baseball caps at certain athletic
And
events.
there's nothing left to do but this.
Your Honor, in the case of Grutter versus Bollinger, this court held that to be the least restrictive means does not mean the exhaustion of all other avenues. Olympus State University has made a good faith attempt and has instituted an individualized, holistic program which does not establish a quota. Thank you, Your Honors.
Thank you. Ms. Collins?